So, with the latest bit of information coming out of the Delphi case, being that there is no DNA that links Richard Allen to Libby and Abby, there's been people in a bit of a flap. You've had the people who are dead set convinced that Allen is innocent, saying, well, there you go, that proves that he's innocent, he needs to be exonerated. You've got other people who are suddenly worrying about people who had perhaps believed that Allen was guilty and are suddenly worrying about perhaps they were wrong in their ideas of him being guilty, or worrying about whether or not he will be convicted, and worrying that what if he is guilty and he's not convicted because there's no DNA evidence. Well, here's the thing. DNA evidence isn't the be-all and end-all of a case. The use of DNA evidence only came about in the early 90s. There were plenty of cases that were tried prior to that time without any DNA, without the knowledge of DNA. Now, of course, there are a lot of cases now where people are being exonerated due to DNA evidence that's basically proven that they were not responsible for a crime. But there were still plenty of crimes where people were convicted without any DNA evidence. Sure, DNA evidence would help to create a stronger case. But DNA evidence isn't always 100% correct. I can guarantee you that if that witness had have said, yes, we have some DNA evidence that has a such and such percentage match to Richard Allen, that the defence probably would have still tore that to shreds and found the holes in that argument. Well, you know, if you've only got so many points DNA match, can you be 100% certain that that's Richard Allen? And no, you can't. You can't actually be conclusive with DNA. You can to a fair extent, but unless it is 100% match, and a lot of times DNA samples aren't enough for you to get 100% match. Quite often the DNA samples are enough to say, well, we can say that this person is definitely a possibility. So even with DNA evidence, that doesn't necessarily mean, or it wouldn't have necessarily meant, that the case was sealed, done and dusted against Richard Allen. It still could have been fought by the defence. But now people are convinced that Allen must be innocent because there was no DNA connecting him to the crime scene. But let's look at it. There's no DNA connecting any male to the crime scene. They found trace evidence of male DNA, which they just don't have the technology yet to actually get a full DNA profile from that evidence. So they actually cannot link any male to that crime scene at all. So it doesn't exclude anybody. It doesn't include anybody, but it doesn't exclude anybody. Now, let's not forget also, Bridge Guy was very heavily clothed. Witnesses who believe they saw Bridge Guy said that he appeared to be overly dressed for the weather of that day. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not the witnesses actually saw Bridge Guy or not. That's not part of this discussion. But let's just go with witnesses who saw the person they believe to be Bridge Guy commented that he did appear overly heavily dressed for that day. And when we look at the image of Bridge Guy, he certainly does look like he has multiple layers on. And what's the other thing with that? We can't see Bridge Guy's hands in the image or in that brief second of video footage. So how do we know that Bridge Guy wasn't wearing gloves? If someone is heavily clothed and wearing gloves, then that is going to diminish the chance of them leaving any DNA on the scene. So perhaps that is why there was little DNA discovered on the scene. And of course it was explained that the trace amounts of male DNA could actually be transferred DNA from other sources. Someone may have previously touched the item of clothing that had the DNA found on it. I can't remember what it was said where the DNA was found, but it can be a transferred DNA. It doesn't necessarily have to have occurred at the crime scene. So that leaves us in a situation where we have no DNA. Does that mean that Richard Allen can't be convicted? Not at all. Like I said, before we had science discovering DNA and we started making convictions using DNA, there were plenty of cases that were solved and where people were convicted and fairly convicted without DNA. But what about most recently? Let's look at the Laurie and Chad Daybell case. Chad Daybell was convicted over the deaths of Tylee and JJ Ryan, and yet there was no evidence of his DNA found on any of the tape, anything to do with the crime scene. And yet there was enough evidence to prove his guilt. We're barely a week into this trial. Yes, it is a disappointment to have no DNA evidence. And I think some people felt disappointed that a whole day was spent in testimony based around DNA evidence that wasn't there. And perhaps some people feel that that's a win for the defence. Some people feel that that's just too much of a blow for the prosecution and that the case is lost. But let's not throw the baby away with the bathwater. At the end of the day, that is one blow. DNA is not definitive. Yes, you can find DNA evidence. You can still argue against that DNA evidence. It's not fail-safe. If there's plenty more evidence against Richard Allen, they can still get a conviction. So this does not prove innocence. Certainly doesn't prove guilt, but it also does not prove innocence. So let's sit tight and see what other evidence comes out during this case. So thanks for listening. If you're new, please hit the subscribe button. Also, if you like my content, please hit the like, and please do leave a comment below. What are your thoughts about the lack of DNA evidence? How bad a blow do you believe this is for the prosecution? Do you believe it is a problem? Or do you think it's just one thing and it's not going to make a huge difference to their case? Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.